Back to the Future, the animated series. It ran for 2 seasons in the early 90s and follows the life of Doc Brown and his family after the events in Back to the Future Part 3. Doc has moved back to 20th Century Hill Valley and has built a new DeLorean time machine. The DeLorean is now controlled by voice commands, and it can do more than it ever did before. It can turn itself into a 4-door, it can work in water, it can turn into a blimp, and it can also turn itself into a briefcase when nobody's driving it. Christopher Lloyd appears at the beginning and end of each episode as Doc.
Dr. Emmett, Harold Brown here.
But during the cartoon, he's voiced by the same voice actor that did Homer Simpson.
Oh!
In the movies, Doc would say,
Great Scott.
but now he's got a few new catchphrases.
Jumpin' gigawatts! Jumpin' gigawatts! Galloping Galileo! Culture!
Oh man, that's painful. Other returning cast members from the movies are Mary Steenburgen, who does the voice of Clara, and Tom Wilson, who does the voice of Biff's ancestors whenever they travel through time. The biggest difference between the movies and the cartoon is that most of the episodes are focused around Doc's kids, Jules and Vern. Jules is the boy genius. He takes after his father and wants to be a scientist, and he acts like a real pecker.
Wow, I'm telling Mother!
Vern is the younger son. He normally wears a coonskin cap, but he sometimes flies around with a helicopter hat. It seems like that'd be a cool thing to have, but it's attached to his head with only a strap under his chin, which means all his body weight is hanging from his head. Realistically, that would probably strangle you or break your neck. Having the show focused on the home life of the Brown family with Clara and the 2 sons kinda sucks. Even Einstein has a larger role as the family's dog. This was the wrong direction to take the cartoon. Nobody wants to see this. They should have just found a way to cut down on the family aspect and focus on Doc and Marty. Though to be fair, a couple episodes do focus on just Doc and Marty, just not enough of them for my taste. Marty isn't the same as he was in the movies. Now he's like a goofball side character. In the films, Marty might have had his silly moments here and there, but they've made him borderline retarded. They do reveal his middle name though, which is interesting.
Martin Seamus McFly?
And I bet you didn't know Doc's middle name.
Dr. Emmett Lathrop Brown? Lathrop? So that's what the L stands for.
Anyhow, I watched the whole series, and there were certain episodes and moments that I want to talk about. In episode 12, entitled Retired, Doc invents some metal running shorts. Watch what he says.
And they used to always give me an aluminum Melvin.
Aluminum Melvin? Does that mean the shorts gave him a boner? If that's not fucked up enough, then Clara walks in covered in shit. Then Doc swipes some off her face and eats it. Yeah, Doc Brown just ate shit. Right after, Vern grabs an apple and puts it into a sack. But does he have to be holding the sack right in front of his brother's, sack? Jeez, I'm not surprised though. After all, this is the same kid that likes to point to his own dick. Yeah, this cartoon really had a lot of innuendos.
I play a pretty mean flute.
And how about this?
Don't you like tossed salad?
For all you international viewers, if you don't know, in the US, tossed salad means, you know what, just Google it. In the episode A Family Vacation, you briefly see Marty, who's walking with Jennifer to Doc's house, when Doc drives away in the DeLorean.
Marty, wasn't that Doc Brown?
Yeah, Jennifer. I don't guess we'll be borrowing the car tonight.
Why would he need to borrow the DeLorean for a date? Doesn't Marty still have that black truck? Or did he park that on the train tracks too? In the episode Forward to the Past, they travel back in time to the prehistoric era. The plot here is that Doc Brown is going to go back in time to test a dangerous invention. They test the invention, and then they want to get back to the present. Meanwhile, Vern is inside the car, and it starts riding away.
Hey, stop! The DeLorean was in gear!
Doc Brown and Jules chase after the car, but they can't run fast enough to catch up with it. A prehistoric pterodon then picks them up and brings them to the car. This is where I take issue. I can suspend my disbelief that they'll travel back to the past and all that, but having this flying dinosaur pick them up, for me, is like a nuking the fridge moment. There's no reason for it to just come out of nowhere and fly them to the car. It's bullshit. In the episode Roman Holiday, they travel back to ancient Rome. Marty gets into a conversation with someone to find out that they speak Latin.
Hey, lady, where can I get a pizza around here?
Mi estás in pede.
So, Doc gives him the universal translator.
There, you need a universal linguistic translator.
That idea was obviously stolen from Star Trek.
The universal translator.
Also in this episode, Biff's Roman counterpart challenges Marty to a race.
I challenge you to a race.
Marty declines, but then Biff calls him a chicken. This upsets Marty, just like it did in the movies, and he accepts Biff's challenge to race. Here's my problem with this. This cartoon clearly indicates that it takes place after the events of Back to the Future Part 3. Well, if that's the case, I don't think Marty would have succumbed to Biff's challenge here, because by this point, Marty is supposed to have learned his lesson about being called a chicken. Remember at the end of Back to the Future Part 3, Marty's gonna race Needles, which gets him into the car accident that injures his hand. But he learns by the end of the movie not to get so steamed up when somebody calls him a name. So this cartoon is actually taking Marty's character a step backward, and I don't buy it. And don't tell me nobody thought of this either. Tom Wilson is the voice actor in this scene. Don't you think he could have spoken up and said, hey, this isn't right? In the episode Dickens of Christmas, there's a Frankenstein toy in the shop window. It clearly appears to be the Boris Karloff-style Frankenstein monster, but the Universal Frankenstein movie wasn't released until 1931, and A Christmas Carol is supposed to take place in 1843, so whoever wrote this fucked up. In episode 15, Doc's time train drives into a volcano. To live through this, Doc and the gang use oven mitt bodysuits to survive the liquid hot magma.
Ha! My full-body oven mitts are the perfect protection against molten lava!
I'll buy the fact that Doc could have invented a way to protect his body from the lava. He's a great scientist after all, but their legs and faces are exposed. What protected their faces from being melted off? Sorry, Doc, I got my doubts about that oven mitt suit. In the episode My Pop's an Alien, they travel back to the 1960s and they see Doc.
Remember, this is 1967.
But Doc doesn't recognize who Marty is. That makes no sense. If this is the Doc Brown from the 1960s, he would know who Marty is because Doc and Marty met in 1955. Now, after watching the whole series, I'm going to tell you what I think were the best moments and the worst moments. My personal best moment would be from the episode of Vern by Any Other Name. In the episode, Vern travels to the past to when his mother Clara was pregnant with himself. Next, Doc and Clara get into a fight, and then Doc leaves the cabin. The only one left to take care of Clara is Vern, and she says that he's gonna have to deliver the baby. So yeah, now it's up to Vern to do the delivery, which of course means he'd be delivering himself.
Hush, Vern, that won't help. It's gonna be up to you now.
Upon hearing this news, Vern passes out. I thought this was legitimately one of the funniest and most well-written parts of the series, because it uses time travel in a manner that makes the audience a bit uncomfortable and in a humorous fashion. It's kind of like the scene in the first movie when Marty's going out on a date with his own mother. A bit twisted, but hilarious. That's where some of the best humor in the movies came from, and they did a great job of incorporating that same style of writing here. Now, the moment I think is the worst comes from the episode Batter Up. Batter Up! The plot here is that Marty discovers he once had an ancestor named Pee-wee that was a terrible baseball player.
Pee-wee McFly, pitcher for the Boston Bean Eaters. What a wimp.
Marty decides to help his ancestor out by giving him an invention Doc made to make him a better baseball player.
Too bad Pee-wee didn't have Pop's invention to help him out.
After the events in Back to the Future Part 2 with the Sports Almanac, I would think Marty would know better by now. Regardless, Marty goes back in time and changes history. Pee-wee doesn't actually use the invention, but by Marty being involved, Pee-wee ends up winning the game. My problem is, after this happens, there's no temporal repercussions. The reason I think this is the worst moment is because it totally rapes the fundamental morals of the entire Back to the Future series.
Marty, I didn't invent the time machine for financial gain.
What kind of lesson do kids learn from this? That it's just fine and dandy to change history according to your own personal desires? Nice message they're sending out to children. For me, this is the worst episode of the series for that reason. Now, like I was saying earlier, they got Christopher Lloyd to host the show.
That's the way to fly!
Sometimes they'd have him stand in front of a blue screen to make it appear like he's on location. Like here, Christopher Lloyd appears to be in prehistoric times, but really he's standing in front of stock footage. What footage do you think that is? Land of the Lost? Nah, that's actually Unknown Island. Or how about here? Doc goes to a baseball game, but he's given a bad seat behind a pillar. Notice there's nobody else sitting on the bleachers, so why doesn't he just move to a better seat? But at the end of each episode, he teaches kids how to do science experiments, like a modern-day Mr. Wizard. To help demonstrate, they used Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Bill Nye the Science Guy.
These small bit parts are supposedly what led him to eventually getting his own show. When I was a kid, I used to try some of these experiments, although I would get annoyed because some of the experiments, they required you to get things that I didn't own.
Next, you'll need some copper tubing.
I don't know about you, but I didn't have copper tubing lying around the house. As a kid, you can't just run out in the car and buy parts from the hardware store. Sure, if you really wanted to, you could ask your parents later on, but then you have to have the discussion and they'd ask, "What do you want that for?" And another problem was that either you needed to be taping the show off TV, or you needed a paper and pencil ready so that you could remember what parts you needed and what the correct steps were to do the experiment. So, Bill Nye explains to the viewers at home how to do each experiment, but then it goes back to Doc, who makes his own version, which is usually a disaster. There was one experiment I remember doing for sure, trying to make a homemade hot air balloon.
Section H. Entry. Hot air balloon.
This is the experiment I remember trying myself when I was a kid. The only difference, now I notice that it says to use a thin plastic bag.
All you need is a very thin plastic bag.
Well, when I was a kid, I used a black garbage bag. I sat there with a blow dryer blowing into the bag, waiting for it to fly into the air. I must have done it for about 5 minutes until eventually the blow dryer got so hot that it overheated and I broke the blow dryer, not to mention melted part of the bag.
The heavier cold air around the balloon squeezes it up like a bubble. And voila!
It always bothered me that I never got that to work. I wanted to see that thing fly. Well, I may not have a time machine, but let's try redoing that experiment now, and maybe it'll help me feel like I've gone back in time. Great